Hey everyone, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop your comments below. Tell us what you think about alternate history and how you imagine things could have played out if Hitler had decided not to invade the Soviet Union. What if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union? An alternate history of the Second World War. Picture a world where the Second World War took a completely different turn. What if Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, had changed his mind and decided not to invade the Soviet Union? This isn't just a fun what-if game. It's a key to understanding the driving forces behind one of the most devastating wars in human history. Historians argue that attacking the Soviet Union wasn't just a part of the war. It was the heart of Hitler's entire plan. Without that invasion, the Second World War might never have happened the way it did, or maybe not at all. So, let's dive into this alternate reality and explore what could have been if Hitler had skipped his biggest gamble, the invasion of the East. In this massive story, I'm not just going to rephrase the original idea in simple terms for American readers. I'm going to expand it with my own thoughts, historical facts, economic insights, and some wild guesses about how the world might look today. We'll journey into a world where history took a different path and try to figure out how one decision could have changed the fate of millions. Ready? Let's get started. Hitler's obsession with the East. To get why invading the Soviet Union was such a big deal for Hitler, we need a peek inside his mind. Adolf Hitler, like many German nationalists of his time, was obsessed with building a greater Germany, a powerful empire that would unite all ethnic Germans under one flag. But his dream went way beyond just bringing Germany and Austria together. He had his eyes set on the vast lands of Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine and Western Russia. For Hitler, these lands weren't just random territories. He called them Lebensraum, or living space, which he believed was essential for the German people to thrive. In his mind, the fertile plains of Ukraine would become Germany's breadbasket, feeding the nation. The Soviet Union's natural resources, oil, coal, metals, would fuel Germany's economy and make it a superpower. On top of that, Hitler imagined colonizing these lands with ethnic Germans who would rule over the local Slavic populations, reduced to little more than servants. This wasn't a new idea. Back in the 1920s, in his book My Struggle, Mein Kampf, Hitler laid it all out. Germany, stuck in the middle of Europe and surrounded by powerful countries, needed to conquer land in the East to become a global powerhouse like the British Empire. Every move he made, taking over Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, and other parts of Western Europe, was just a stepping stone to prepare for the big prize, invading the Soviet Union. The economic angle. Guns instead of butter. Now let's talk money. Wars aren't just about ideology. They're about economics too. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany was still reeling from the Great Depression. Unemployment was sky high, people were struggling, and frustration was everywhere. To win over the German people, Hitler went all in on government spending. He built roads, those famous autobahns, factories, and tons of military equipment, creating jobs and boosting the economy. But all this came at a huge cost. Hjalmar Schacht, Hitler's early economics minister, warned that this guns instead of butter approach was a recipe for disaster. By guns, he meant military spending. By butter, he meant everyday essentials like food, clothing, and goods for regular people. Schacht thought Germany couldn't keep up this level of spending without seizing new resources. But Hitler was convinced the resources of the East, oil from the Caucasus, grain from Ukraine, coal from the Donbass, would save Germany's economy from collapse. Without invading the Soviet Union, Germany would have been in deep trouble. By 1941, military spending had drained the budget. Gold and foreign currency reserves were running low, and while occupied Western Europe provided some resources, it wasn't enough to keep the war machine going. If Hitler had scrapped his plan to invade the Soviet Union, called Operation Barbarossa, he'd have needed another way to keep the economy afloat. But what? Alternate scenario. What if Hitler turned west? Let's imagine Hitler changes his mind. Instead of sending his armies east, he focuses on Western Europe, maybe even doubling down on defeating Great Britain. What would have happened? Let's break it down step by step. 1. The challenge of Great Britain. By 1940, Germany had already conquered France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other Western European countries. But Great Britain was still standing strong. Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade the British Isles, was shelved after Germany lost the Battle of Britain, where the German Air Force, Luftwaffe, couldn't overpower the British Royal Air Force. If Hitler had decided against invading the Soviet Union, he might have thrown everything into defeating Britain. He could have poured resources into building more planes, ships, or even new weapons to try to break Britain's defenses. But this would have been a tough fight. The British Navy was much stronger than Germany's, and Britain's island geography made invasion tricky. Germany could keep bombing British cities, but without control of the seas, landing an army was nearly impossible. Plus, Britain had a powerful ally in the United States. Even before the U.S. officially joined the war in December 1941, the Lend-Lease program was supplying Britain with weapons, food, and resources. If Hitler had waged a long war against Britain, he'd have faced growing resistance and dwindling resources. Germany's economy, already stretched thin, might not have survived. 2. Economic decline and domestic trouble. Without the resources of the East, Germany would have hit a wall. Occupied Western Europe provided some supplies. France, for example, sent food and industrial goods, but it couldn't meet Germany's massive needs, especially for oil and raw materials for weapons. The British Navy's blockade made importing resources harder, choking Germany's economy. By 1941, ordinary Germans were already feeling the pinch. Food, clothing, and fuel were rationed. If Hitler had avoided the Soviet invasion but kept fighting in the West, discontent at home could have grown. Germans, inspired by Hitler's promises of a glorious empire, might have started asking, "Where's the prosperity you promised? Why is this war dragging on?" 3. The potential collapse of the Third Reich. Without the Soviet invasion, the Third Reich could have faced a crisis from within. Hitler's rise to power was built on promises of greatness and wealth for Germans. His propaganda painted a picture of a mighty Germany challenging old empires like Britain and France. But if the war stalled and the economy tanked, his support might have crumbled. Historical records show that by 1941, there were already small protests in Germany over food shortages. If Hitler couldn't deliver a new goal, like victory over the Soviet Union, his regime might have faced rebellion or even a coup. The military, the elite, or even parts of the Nazi Party could have turned against him, looking for a new leader. 4. The Soviet Union's response. What about the Soviet Union in all this? Joseph Stalin, the Soviet leader, was a cautious and pragmatic ruler. In 1939, he signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany, splitting Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This deal let Germany invade Poland while the Soviet Union took the Baltic states, parts of Poland, and Bessarabia. If Hitler had skipped the invasion, Stalin would likely have used the time to strengthen his military and economy. In 1941, the Soviet Union wasn't fully ready for war with Germany, but by 1943 or 44, the Red Army could have been much stronger. Stalin might have modernized tanks, planes, and factories. There's even a chance Stalin would have attacked Germany first if he saw the Third Reich weakening. Some historians, citing documents found after the Soviet Union's collapse, suggest Stalin was considering an offensive war in the early 1940s. If Germany got bogged down fighting Britain, Stalin might have seized the moment to strike. Economic breakdown. Could Germany survive without the East? Let's look at the numbers to understand what Germany faced without invading the Soviet Union. According to historical research, in 1940, Germany was spending about 60% of its GDP on the military. That's a huge chunk, considering most countries in peacetime spend only 5 to 10% on defense. Germany's main sources of income during the war were taxes, and domestic resources. Germans paid high taxes, and factories were running at full capacity to produce weapons. But internal resources were drying up fast. Occupied territories, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands supplied food, labor, and industrial goods. For example, in 1940, France provided about 20% of its agricultural output to Germany. Imports. Germany relied on imports for oil, metals, and other resources. Romania supplied oil, and Sweden provided iron ore, but Britain's naval blockade made these imports harder to get. Without the Soviet Union's resources, Germany couldn't sustain this economy for long. For instance, in 1941, Germany used about 7 million tons of oil per year, but produced only 1 million tons domestically. The rest had to come from imports or occupied territories. The Soviet Union's oil fields in the Caucasus were seen as the answer to this problem. If Hitler had abandoned the invasion, he might have tried to find other resource sources, like pressuring Romania for more oil or attempting to seize oil fields in the Middle East. But that was risky too. German forces in North Africa were already losing to the British, and controlling the Middle East would have required massive resources. Alternate reality, a new world without the Eastern Front. Now, let's have some fun and imagine how the world might look if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union. Here are a few possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Germany focuses on the West. Hitler decides defeating Britain is more important than going east. He pours resources into building a bigger navy and air force to crush Britain. Maybe Germany develops new tech, like better submarines or rockets, to hit British ports and cities. But Britain doesn't give up. Winston Churchill, Britain's prime minister, rallies the nation to keep fighting. The U.S. ramps up Lend-Lease aid, and by 1942, America joins the war after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, which likely would have happened anyway, since Japan acted independently. In this scenario, Germany burns through its resources fighting the West. The economy weakens, discontent grows, and by 1943, Hitler's regime starts to crack. Maybe there's a coup, and the Nazis lose power. A new leader might try to negotiate peace with Britain and the US, but the Allies demand total surrender. Outcome: the Second World War ends earlier, but Germany still loses. The Soviet Union stays out of the fight, builds up its military, and becomes an even stronger power by the war's end. Scenario 2. The Cold War starts early. If Hitler doesn't attack, Stalin might see an opportunity. He waits while Germany and Britain wear each other out, then strikes. The Red Army, upgraded over a few years, invades Eastern Europe, taking Poland, Romania, and maybe parts of Germany. In this case, the world splits between two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, much earlier than in real history. The Cold War kicks off in the mid-1940s. Germany becomes a battleground between East and West, much like it did after the real war, but with even bigger consequences. Scenario 3. Hitler changes his game plan. In the wildest scenario, Hitler completely shifts gears. He gives up on Lebensraum in the East and tries to build a European empire by uniting occupied Western Europe. Germany might attempt an economic alliance to rival Britain and the US, but this seems unlikely. Nazism was built on racism and expansion. Without new conquests, Hitler couldn't keep his people's support. Plus, occupied countries like France, Belgium, and the Netherlands weren't eager to cooperate. Resistance movements in these countries grew stronger every year. What does this mean for us today? If you think about it, Hitler's decision not to invade the Soviet Union could have changed not just the war, but the entire modern world. Without the devastating invasion, where about 27 million Soviets died, the world might have avoided massive human losses. Europe could have been less divided after the war. The Cold War might have started earlier or not happened at all if the Soviet Union and the West found common ground against a weakened Germany. Economically, things would have been different too. Germany, not exhausted by a two-front war, might have preserved more resources and recovered faster. The Soviet Union, spared the loss of millions and vast territories, could have become an even bigger powerhouse than it did. But there's a flip side. Nazism's hateful, expansionist ideology wouldn't have just vanished. Even without the Eastern Front, Hitler or his followers might have kept pushing aggression, discrimination, and repression. The world could have faced new conflicts, just in a different form. Call to action. Share your thoughts. This alternate history is just one of many possibilities. What do you think? How would the world have changed if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union? Got your own ideas or scenarios? Subscribe to the channel and leave your comments below. Let's geek out together over how one decision could have flipped history upside down. Your thoughts matter, and I can't wait to hear them. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Tell us what grabbed you most in this alternate history and what scenarios you'd love to explore next.